Welcome back to Holiness the Lord. Here we're jumping back into the book of 2 Kings, but we'll have to come back one more time to finally finish it once we're all done with Isaiah and stuff. So in 2 Kings, chapter 17, verses 7 through 12, and then 15 through 18, here's where we get the idea of the lost 10 tribes from. And it's interesting that I'm studying it closely for the first time, and that the reason for their captivity is that they're worshiping idols and turning away from the true worship of God. It's interesting because I'm sympathetic to the idea of the upcoming reform of Hezekiah and Josiah, that it was heavy-handed and overstepped by throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that there were some good things done away with in the reforms. However, verse 16 is specific that at least the worst cases of the children of Israel, they were literally back to worshipping calves and Baal. And the hosts of heaven, which is likely referring to the worship of the sun, moon, and stars. So, obviously, some reforms were probably needed. In verses 24 through 34, it's interesting that here in the beginning of the Samaritans, Assyria sent people to intermingle with those who had left the northern kingdoms, and thus their worship would have been the philosophies of the Assyrians mingled with Israelite scripture. So, as much as Christ definitely taught that the Jews shouldn't hate the Samaritans and should minister to them, I can see why there was enmity between the two groups, because the Samaritans would have over time taken sacred practices and adopted them into their set of religious beliefs that involved the paganism of Assyria. In chapter 18, verse 4, here we get into the interesting reforms of Hezekiah. He removed the high places and brake the images and cut down the groves and broke the brazen serpent. And then he called it Nehushtan, which is a very contemptuous way to refer to the brazen serpent made by Moses. Now, there are those who think that Hezekiah did all these things correctly, and that there are those who think he overstepped his bounds. I find it interesting that the Book of Mormon has prophets who speak of the brazen serpent, but they do so only positively, and about how it was a type of Christ. So I find it difficult to believe that Hezekiah was 100% correct, because he destroyed and spoke poorly of one of the most iconic types of Christ. And frankly, I think the Book of Mormon is less likely to have been altered by, political and factional groups who really wanted, them to write the history. In verses 15 through 16, again, Hezekiah, like many previous leaders of Israel, gave the treasures of the temple up as bribery to other nations. Doesn't sound like a good idea, or that Hezekiah was unlike any ruler before or after, as verse 5 seems to imply. So, Hezekiah could have been a good guy, but doesn't seem like he was amazingly better than everybody else. Kind of seems like he's overhyped a little bit. But in chapter 19, verses 1 through 2 and 14 through 15, that isn't to say Hezekiah is a bad guy. In his time of need, he turned to the house of the Lord and to God's prophet, who was Isaiah. So definitely doing everything he should do correctly at this time. Hezekiah goes and takes his prayers directly to the Lord in the temple, just like the altar of incense, his prayers going up to the Lord. And Hezekiah says that God sits between cherubim, which is correct in a number of ways, because there are cherubim on the veil of the temple, as well as on either side of the mercy seat, which is the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. And in chapter 20, verses 4 through 6, again, when the Lord heals Hezekiah through his servant Isaiah, the Lord commands Hezekiah to go to the house of the Lord on the third day to be healed, which is a cool connection. And again, if Hezekiah is righteous enough to be commanded of the Lord to go do things to be healed, he's not like the worst person in the world who did horrible reforms. Well, who knows about the reforms, but he's not all good or all bad, is what I'm trying to say. But because we have been talking about Isaiah, now I get to jump into Isaiah, which means these will probably be a lot slower coming, or there will be lots of sections of Isaiah, because it's dense stuff and I've really wanted to dig in a lot, and I have several different resources, and it's going to be a good time. So thanks, and I'll see you next time for Isaiah.